Let's begin with some prose. The Telltale Heart. True, nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been, and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing, acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, at about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously. Cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into his chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him as he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there I was, opening his door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea. And perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with a thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened for fear of robbers, and I knew he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily, steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening and the old man sprang up in bed crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour, I did not move a muscle. And in the meantime, I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in bed listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was a groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh, no. It was a low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew that sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, as all the world has slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echoes the terrors that distracted me. I say, I knew what the old man felt and pitied him. Although I fairly chuckled at heart. I knew he'd been lying awake ever since that first slight noise when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor. Or, it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes. He had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain. Because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of this unforeseen shadow which caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the very presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until, at length, a simple, dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I could see it with a perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow of my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon that damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but an over-acuteness of the sense? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart, and it increased my fury as a beating of a drum stimulates a soldier into courage. But even yet, I kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quick, quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. You mark me well. I've told you that I'm nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for many minutes I kept still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leapt into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. Yet for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected that there was anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bells sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own, in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them, at length, to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things, but ere long I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently with a heightened voice, and yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, and yet the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still, the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no. No, they heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, hark, again. Louder, 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 louder. Villains, I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks here, here. It is the beating of his hideous hearts. Thank you. I do hope that that earlier warning was appropriate for the front row. Now then, we're gathered today to talk about fact and fiction, fantasy and reality. What I've just performed for you, of course, is fiction, a short story that I wrote as part of my life and my works as an American author. Now, let's talk about fact. Very briefly, let's talk about the basic facts of my life. And since the basic facts of my life are easily found by any means of research that you might have at your fingertips today, I'm just going to skip around a bit and hit the high points. Is that okay with you? Absolutely. Wonderful. We can always fill in any questions that you might have at the end. I was born January 19th, 1809. My mother and my father were both actors. I was born while they were touring in Boston. My mother was notably more successful than my father. My father once received a poor review from a critic. He tracked down that critic at his apartment and threatened to punch him in the face. It doesn't do to have a thin skin as an actor or as a writer. I had an older brother, William Henry Poe, and soon a younger sister, Rosalie. Now, we were told while we were very young that our father had passed away, but that's actually not true. The truth of the matter is he ran off and abandoned his young wife and 3 children. He moved to upstate New York, where he became an accountant for the rest of his life and had no connection with the family at all. Now, my mother was described to me as beautiful and a highly talented actress, but I have no memory of her because she did pass away when I was only 2 years old of consumption, what's now known as tuberculosis. Now, orphaned and abandoned, my brother and my sister and I were divided up and sent to live with 3 different sets of relatives who volunteered to take each of us in singly, so we were never raised as a family. Now, we knew of each other, of course, and we kept a loose correspondence, and we would meet later in life, but we were not raised as children together. I was sent to live with my older cousins, the John Allen family, in the state of Virginia. Now, Mr. Allen and his wife at that time had no children of their own, and Mrs. Allen took me in and raised me as her own son with all of the love that a mother could give. Now, I was born Edgar Poe, but because of Mrs. Allen's love for me and her caring, I took on the name Allen as my middle name out of respect for her for the rest of my life. Now, Mr. Allen was a very successful Virginia merchant, so successful that he was able to travel back to his homeland of Scotland and then in England for quite a number of years, taking his young family with him. And so I was given an education in some of the finest schools in Scotland and in England, and that was very rare for a young man from America in those days. Eventually, we came back here to the States. I continued my education, and I entered into the University of Virginia in only the 2nd year of its founding. And to give you a sense of the time period that I'm talking about here, I and all the young men who were students at the University of Virginia in those days, and in those days it was only men who could be students in higher education, we each had dinner with the founder of that school. And that gentleman who I had dinner with was Thomas Jefferson. Now, Mr. Jefferson's ideas for his young school were just as radical as his ideas for this young nation. He instituted a disciplinary system which was overseen, staffed, and run by the students themselves. It went about as well as you could expect. They went through quite a number of students and staff in those early days. And that disciplinary system is actually still in place at the University of Virginia today, just in a highly amended format. Now, I was excellent in my studies. I was very good in all of my classes. But I broke some of the campus rules, as was very common. I gambled at cards with my friends. And so I incurred some debts, and I turned to my very rich foster father, Mr. Allen, and I asked him for a loan to cover not only my educational costs and housing and books and so on, but my gambling debts too. And he refused. And so I was forced to drop out. Now, I joined the Army shortly after that with an intention to go out into the world on my own and be self-supportive. I was in the Army for some time and did perfectly fine as well, but then I received word that my foster mother, Mrs. Allen, the woman who raised me as her own son, had taken gravely ill. I was able to travel back home just in time for her funeral. That would be the second mother I was unable to say goodbye to. Now, perhaps feeling a little guilty over his treatment of me at school, Mr. Allen helped me to receive a discharge from the Army. Now, much later it'd be rumored that I went AWOL, and that's not true at all. In those days, you could actually pay someone to take your place. And Mr. Allen had the money to do so, and that's what he did. And so I received a completely legal discharge, completely respectable at that time too, from the Army. After that, I entered into West Point as a cadet. And again, I did perfectly fine in my studies. I did very well at the school and had a great many friends who actually helped me to raise money to publish my first collections of poetry, Tamerlane and other poems. But I felt that the cadet lifestyle really wasn't conducive to being one of the greatest poets in America. So it was time for me to strike out on my own for real this time. And so to leave, I neglected some of my required duties and I was dismissed. Now, I went to visit my closest living relative, which was my older brother, William. I spent some time with him, and while I was there, I met a young lady by the name of Virginia Clem. After a short courtship, and with the full support of her widowed mother, Virginia and I were married. Mrs. Clem moved in with us, and we would remain a family for the rest of our lives. Now then, the master of the macabre, the father of the modern horror story. Well-earned accolades. But when I started publishing and becoming one of the greatest writers in America, I did some other things, which not everybody seems to remember nowadays, and that's what I want to talk about. So in my story, and who here has read my story, The Murders of the Rue Morgue? Oh, good. An educated public, exactly what I like. And for those of you who may not have read it, or if it's been a while, I need to just go over the plot very briefly. Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil the story for those who haven't read it, just so that you understand the plot. It's very important. So, in my story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, it is told to you from a narrator's point of view, an Englishman who's traveling in France, in Paris, and he's down on his luck, so he has to share a ratty set of rooms with a Parisian, a gentleman by the name of Auguste Dupin. And he and Auguste share an interest in the darker areas of life, in the macabre, in the bizarre, in true crime, exactly what entertains many people today. And so when they learn of a ghastly murder that happens in an apartment building that completely confuses and flummoxes the local police, they take an interest. And the murder that occurred happened to a woman and her daughter who were living in an upper floor apartment in the street morgue, the Rue Morgue. And they are attacked late one evening in their own apartment while the door to their apartment is locked shut from the inside. And everyone in the building can hear the attack. They can hear it happening, but they can't get into the room. They call the local police. The police batter down the door, but it's too late. What's left behind is a grisly murder scene. Blood and gore is everywhere across the floors. One body has been attacked and its throat cut and shoved upside down into the flue of the chimney, which would take immense strength to do so. The other body attacked with a straight razor, the neck cut so deeply that the head was held on by only a tiny bit of tissue on the back of the neck, thrown out of the window into the courtyard below, and that window slammed shut and locked from the inside. And this was a tiny apartment. There was no place to hide. There was no sign of the murderer. And everyone had been watching the door. No one came in or out. There were no secret passageways, no way to get out of an upper floor apartment through the window, and again, locked from the inside. And there was even gold left behind in full view that the mother and the daughter had saved for their rent. And so there was no motive either. How could it happen and why? So the police have no idea. But Auguste is a genius of a man, a very strange individual with great powers of observation. And so using his connections in the police force, he goes to the apartment along with the narrator, and he notices tiny little bits of information left behind by the killer. Clues that the police had overlooked. And using his rational senses and using logic and deduction, he pieces together how the murder must have happened from those clues. And so he lays a trap for that murderer. And I'll let you finish the story on your own if you haven't read it or if it's been a while, so you get to find out how it ends. But that story was so popular that I had to publish sequels. The Case of Marie Roget and The Purloined Letter. And those three stories, and the Case of Marie Roget was actually based on a true crime that happened in New York to a woman by the name of Mary Rogers. I just took that from the newspaper headlines and transported the crime into Paris for the necessities of my story and worked it out from there. Those three stories, in their entirety, created the detective genre. There were no detective stories, as you think of them today, prior to those three stories. And the formats of those particular three stories, in the case of Marie Roget, the crime is ongoing at a distance, and the detective learns about it at a distance and solves it that way. In The Purloined Letter, the crime is an ongoing event that the detective inserts themselves into to change the outcome of it. Or in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the crime has already occurred, and the detective is solving it after that occurrence. Those three formats are the three formats of every single detective story ever written, ever published, ever performed, ever broadcast since that time. And that particular format of an Englishman sharing rooms with a very strange, very socially awkward, very genius detective as they travel around having adventures and solving crimes, and he writes down their stories, should remind you of somebody else's stories. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, written somewhat later. And when asked about what sort of influence my stories had on his stories, he said, well, there was some small influence, of course, but really not all that much. How very interesting, considering he lifted entire passages of conversation straight from my stories and put them into the mouths of his characters. And often considered to be the master of the modern detective story because everyone likes Sherlock Holmes so much for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's work. That's interesting because here in America, we have the Mystery Writers Association. And the Mystery Writers Association every year gives out an award for the best new mystery story, best new mystery writer, collection of stories, and so on. And that award that they give out is called the Edgar, not the Arthur. Now, also depending on who you talk to, what literary genius that you might follow along with, I had influence on another genre as well. My story, which, again, this takes a little bit of setup, is now called The Great Balloon Hoax. It was actually written originally as an intentionally fictionalized newspaper story. Now, newspaper hoaxes were very common back in my day because there were so many different newspapers and they were vying for readers, and journalism hadn't quite worked its rules out at that time. So writing hoaxes to bring in readers was incredibly common. It was very, very common. And science was changing so much that creating a science-based story was very believable because new discoveries were happening all the time. And so with the full understanding cooperation with an editor of a New York newspaper, I wrote a carefully researched story about an Englishman who was experimenting in a new form of transportation, and he creates a lighter-than-air balloon in an attempt to fly across the English Channel, but he actually ends up on the east coast of America, blown off course, traveling across the Atlantic in only 3 days. And that was amazing and very believable, not only because of these changes that were happening in my day, but because I carefully took the science facts, the engineering facts, all of these things that were happening and being published about, and I spun them forward into fiction. So it was very fact-based, but very believable as it went into the fiction. And so people just mobbed the newspaper office trying to learn more about this Englishman who traveled across the Atlantic in 3 days by air. And within a short period of time, the editor published published a statement stating this was actually a hoax. It was very entertaining by the poet and critic Mr. Poe, and isn't that wonderful? And they went on from there. But that story now is called The Great Balloon Hoax. It is considered to be one of the greatest newspaper hoaxes in American history. And that format of that story, of an Englishman creating a lighter-than-air balloon to travel across the world in a very short period of time, should remind you of somebody else's story. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. And Mr. Verne is considered to be the father or the grandfather of the modern science fiction genre. But what is science fiction? It's taking science fact and spinning it forward into fantasy, into fiction. And that's what I did. And I will say that Jules Verne was actually a great fan of my works, and he was very appreciative and very publicly stated how much he liked my work. So I appreciate that. It's too bad not other writers could have done the same. And just because we have such a short period of time to share today, I'm going to skip talking about my longest work, which is the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, in which a young man is shanghaied onto a whaling vessel captained by a crazy man as they travel across the seas of the world looking for very symbolic white things, and what sort of influence that had on American literature too. Now, though these stories were very popular, at the time that I was writing, it was incredibly hard to try to be a writer in America. I was the first American writer to try to support myself solely on my writing alone. All the other authors that you may know from my time, of Lowell and Hawthorne and all the rest, they had other means of income. I was the first American writer to try to support myself and my family solely on my writing. It was incredibly difficult. I don't know that it's gotten that much better now, but we were well acquainted with poverty. And so we moved around trying to find the best area to be a writer in, from Richmond into Philadelphia, and then eventually on up into New York. And we were living in a tiny rented building called The Cottage in New York. I was continuing my work as a writer when my young wife was singing one day, and she had a coughing fit and started coughing up blood. Now, I stated in my letters to my friends that she had an attack, but she was recovering, and she was always very delicate, but she would be fine and her health was improving. But her health didn't improve. And it became very clear over the course of my letters that I was obviously ignoring the signs of consumption, tuberculosis. But I was the only means of income for my family, and so I continued to work. And I was spending a short trip into the city, and I stayed overnight with a family friend of ours, and I penned a poem, The Raven. And The Raven was instantly popular. It sold for $7. That was a week's rent. That's actually not bad at all. But it was so popular, it resold over and over again. And soon I was asked to do exactly what I'm doing today, which is to first appear in private salons and private homes, and then eventually to give public talks about my theories of poetry and my theories of writing, and to read The Raven because it was just so popular. But even though The Raven was starting to bring in the attention to my works that I had needed for so long, it didn't really bring in that much money. And I wrote to a friend of mine that even with this success, all is hollow without Virginia. Her health continued to decline until on January 30th, 1847, she passed away at the cottage. We were so poor at that time that a friend of ours, who was a publisher of a newspaper, put an ad in his paper asking for donations of just clean sheets for her sickbed. She was laid to rest, and I kept a promise to her. I joined the Sons of Temperance, and I stopped drinking alcohol. It had always been some sort of issue over the course of my life. And it's a possibility that alcoholism may have been a disease that affected all the men in my family, possibly. I joined the Sons of Temperance and I stopped drinking alcohol for about 2 months. There was no understanding of the kind of support system, emotional support system, that a person would need in those days. Just try harder, just pray a little bit harder. It's your personal problem. But I continued to write, and I had my own works to worry about, and I was also supporting Mrs. Clem, my mother-in-law, who was still living with me. And so my intention was to start my own literary journal. And so in 1849, in October of 1849, I told Mrs. Clem that I would be traveling down to Philadelphia to find some writers to ask for them to donate some works to what I was trying to start, which is the literary journal. So I left the cottage, and I ended up in Baltimore. No one knows why. I stayed overnight at a family friend of ours, Dr. John Sartain, and when I left his house the next morning, I accidentally left my walking stick behind and took his by mistake. He described me as seeming paranoid and out of sorts. No one knows what happened after that. But on October 3rd, 1849, I was found senseless outside of a bar in Baltimore the day after an election. I was wearing a ratty set of clothes which did not belong to me. No one knows what happened to my clothes. I wasn't recognized at that moment as being anyone special, so I was taken to the local hospital, and that was about the worst thing you could do for anyone who was sick in those days. This is before aspirin was discovered. If you went in vertical, you definitely came out horizontal. I was seeming to be out of my head, but eventually I guess I must have said my name because the doctor who was treating me at my bedside got word back to Mrs. Clem, to my family, that I was in that hospital. And I use the term doctor, treating, and hospital very loosely here. Mrs. Clem contacted my cousin Nielsen, and Nielsen traveled down to try to find me and try to retrieve me. But it was too late because on October 7th, 1849 at 5 o'clock in the morning, I died. I was laid to rest first in an unmarked grave in the West Hill Church Cemetery. Nielsen came down, retrieved my belongings, was able to identify my grave, and he was instrumental later in having a marker put there. And then much, much later, my remains would be removed and placed in the front part of the cemetery because tourists could get there much easier. And over time, Virginia was disinterred and reinterred there, and then Mrs. Clem, much later, was disinterred and reinterred there as well. And there we remain for a family for the rest of our days. Now then, those are the basic facts of my life. Let's talk about fiction again. Very, very briefly, we're going to talk about the fiction of my obituary and legacy. We're going to clear up a few things here, and then we'll finish up with some poetry. Okay. So, this is the first obituary published after my death. Bear that in mind. This is the first obituary. I'm just going to read you the first few sentences. It's actually quite long, but you'll get the gist. Pay close attention. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. The poet was known personally or by reputation in all this country. He had readers in England and in several estates of Europe, but he had few or no friends. And the regrets for his death will be suggested principally by the consideration that in him literary art has lost one of its most brilliant but erratic stars. It goes on from there, but you get the gist. That was written by a gentleman who I used to work with by the name of Reverend Rufus Wilmot Griswold. Reverend Griswold worked on one of the journals that I worked on. He loved poetry. He actually published some of the first collections of American poets. He was not a poet himself. He actually was never that accomplished of a writer, but he did like poetry. And he took my recommendations for what poets to publish. And much later, when I was appearing on stage and doing my public performances, he would contact me and ask me to mention his collections of poetry that were for sale nowadays and so on. But other than that, we didn't have much of a relationship, which is strange, because he published this first obituary. And then he showed up on the doorstep of Mrs. Clem after my death, and he produced a document which he said I signed, making him my literary executor, which would make him legally responsible and owning all of my works, both published and unpublished, including any private writings as well. Mrs. Clem had no reason to disbelieve Reverend Griswold, so she turned over all of my writings to him. She expected that he would provide her with some income from these writings because as a widowed woman in those days, she could have no job, could not own land, or do really anything with money or a bank without a man in the family doing it for her. And there were no men left. He did publish my works, and he did make excellent money from them, and eventually over time sold off my personal letters, sold off my signatures, and so on, and he provided her with absolutely nothing. Thankfully, a family friend of ours knew of the situation and took her in for the last few years of her life. Otherwise, she would have ended up in the poorhouse. My younger sister, Rosalie, was still alive in those days. She should have received something as well, and she received absolutely nothing, too. But she was married at that time, so she did have family support, thank God. Griswold not only published this obituary, but he went on to edit some of my writings after my death and publish those edited versions, publish his collections of my writings, and then over time produce newspaper articles about my life in which he would do exactly what he did in this obituary, which is praise my works, but then slip in lies along with the praise, starting very small, but then working his way up quickly. So few or no friends, not true. He then wrote about how I stole money from the men that I worked with, like from my employers, not true. How I not only abused alcohol, which was known to be an issue in my life, but that while I was drunk, I was abusive to my own wife, who I loved dearly, also not true. That over time, I was not only abusive to her, but I cheated on her, and that I fathered illegitimate children, that I stole belongings from my close friends. I stole books from them, and books were very expensive in those days. And over time, he also wrote about abusing drugs, opium derivatives, and so on. And he created, and this is, I'm stretching a long period of time and compressing it just for our time here today. He created the legend of Edgar Allan Poe, the madman. And he did this so believably because he would praise my works. It didn't sound like it was just a complete character assassination. He would say, well, he was a great writer, but oh, he had such personal problems, and then he would slip in another lie. And men that I worked with would write into the papers and write their own articles about my life and say, well, that's not true. He didn't steal money from me when he worked for me. He was perfectly pleasant to be around. We would go to the bar together after finishing work, and he was wonderful to be around. And he loved his wife, and he didn't borrow anything that he never brought back or paid back, and so on. And all Griswold had to do was publish one of my letters. And there in one of my letters would be that little admission of guilt. And so those other writers, those other friends would start to repeat those things and say, well, maybe he did that, but he was such a still caring person, and he was such a good writer, and so on. And Griswold had all of the proof. And so over time, by the time he reached to just sitting down and writing the first biography, he could prove every single lie that he made up because he owned all of it. And it wasn't until much later, and by much later I mean the 20th century, well into, I believe it was the 1950s perhaps, that a gentleman by the name of Arthur Quinn, Quinn, wrote the first carefully researched, well-researched biography of my life. And he went back, found those original letters, which were still visible in collections and museums today, and he published Griswold's version of the letter next to the photostated version of the original letter. And you could see my line, my line, my line, inserted line, inserted line, inserted line by Griswold, my line, my line. Now, this was known to literary people at that point anyways, but Quinn was the one to first put it into one volume with all of the proof right next to it. And Quinn's work became the foundation for all of the modern scholarship on my life. But by that time, it was too late. The legend had simply taken hold. The legend's just much more entertaining than the truth. And the truth would be of a caring, talented, dedicated writer who loved his family very much, who just happened to have an ability and an interest in the Gothic, in the bizarre, in the darker areas of life. And that's what entertains many people today. Detective stories, true crime, horror movies, and so on. Completely entertaining today. And it doesn't take a monster to write that. No one ever wonders if Herman Melville was a whale. He was just a writer. And that's what I was. But that legend just fit the stories so well. Well, of course, that's what it takes. A madman to write about chopping someone up and putting them under the floorboards, or walling up a wife who's been killed accidentally with her black cat into the wall, or walling up someone into their cellar out of revenge for some unknown insult. That's what it would take, of course. And so that became the legend of Edgar Allan Poe, the madman. And yeah, hunched over his writing desk in the middle of the night with a bottle of opium on one side and a bottle of rum on the other and a raven on his shoulders, he scratches away with lightning. Yes, that's what entertains everyone. That's what's on all the t-shirts, right? But he was never a good writer on his own, but inadvertently Griswold was one of the greatest fictionalists in American history by creating a character that was popular, because I think his intention, now he didn't say this himself, but I think his intention was, out of his jealousy for my abilities, because he could never write on his own, out of his jealousy, his intention was to publish my works, get his 30 pieces of silver from that, and then destroy my reputation and make everyone believe that I was this horrible monster. And then, of course, no one would want to read my works at that point. No good person would sit down to read the works of the monster. And he would make sure that I was forgotten to history and completely buried. But that's interesting how history works. He never understood what the public likes. They love a scandal. And he kept my name in the papers for years, defended by some of the greatest writers in the world. And he inadvertently created a character that was so entertaining and so loved that that character is still recognizable today on t-shirts and on stickers and in movies. And although that legend has overshadowed the truth, it is still culturally appropriate. It's still cared for and loved across the world, and inadvertently helped to make sure that my writings were still read. And these writings were incredibly influential, setting up the modern horror genre, the modern American short story, the modern poetry of America, the modern detective story, and science fiction, and so on. That influence is still here, but the character is what has entered into pop culture. But it's so interesting if that was his intention, to make sure I'd be forgotten, because when I speak to a group of educated adults traveling around to libraries and schools and public audiences, and I say Reverend Rufus Wilmot Griswold, very few people in my audience ever raise an eyebrow, but everyone knows Edgar Allan Poe. And so if I ever was to run into the shade of Reverend Griswold while I travel about the earth, there are many things I'd like to say to that man, but first and foremost is thank you for all your hard work. I really appreciate it. But he did love poetry. I give him that. And that's something that we shared. So I wish to end their formal presentation this evening on poetry. And since I was found senseless outside of a bar, which was actually also a polling place, and that's kind of important on the day after an election, we're going to take a vote today. And the vote is on which of my poems that we'll finish up this presentation with. And since this is today, everyone gets to vote. Please only vote once. So the three options that you have, of course, are going to be The Raven, absolutely popular, just as popular today as it was in my day. And how many authors can say that? And once I was speaking in Boston to, in my lifetime, to over 5,000 people at the Athenaeum, and I intended that at that point I had read The Raven so many times I was a little tired of it myself. And so I was reading one of my older poems I wrote when I was only 14 years old. I was quite proud of it, but people started to get up and walk out. So I had to switch and do The Raven immediately. It was always a public favorite. So The Raven will be one option. Annabel Lee will be a second option, absolutely beloved today, and actually published posthumously. We can talk about that too. And lastly, one small, very short poem that very few people seem to know nowadays, but I think it's particularly appropriate for theater, and that is Conqueror Worm. It's something that affects all of us at some point. So, we'll take a vote, and we'll do this by show of hands, and we'll go from last to first. So everyone that would like to hear Conqueror Worm, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Annabel Lee. Interesting. 1. Okay, and The Raven. 1, 2, 3, 4. Interesting. Okay. So, an interesting audience. So Conqueror Worm actually won out just slightly ahead of Annabel Lee. Just slightly. And I don't feel like recounting any votes at this point. So you have an assignment. You must go home and read The Raven later on. Now, remember, bear this in mind, I was writing for an educated adult public, and very often my stories and my poems are first introduced to people in 5th grade or 6th grade because they are so carefully written, so carefully put together that they are easy for young readers to be able to step into that next level of literature. And that's great. I think that's absolutely wonderful. Unfortunately, the shadow side of that is that many people remember reading it a long time ago and it was entertaining and different than what they read in class, and they unintentionally put it into the ideas of juvenilia because that's when they read it. But remember, I was writing for an educated adult public, one who would understand the bits of Latin or Greek that I might throw into a story, or especially adults who understand love and loss, feelings that thankfully most children have never experienced, the loss of someone that you care for very deeply and what that does to you. So many people, when they go back and reread my stories as adults or over the course of your lifetime, they bring those adult experiences to these poems and the stories, and they understand them at a depth that they never could have touched before. So I strongly encourage you to please go back and reread the poetry, reread the stories now as adults, and encourage your friends to do so too. So The Raven is one that you have to read on your own. But to finish our formal presentation, we have Conqueror Worm. And, okay, since they were so close, and since they are also both very short poems, I'll throw in Annabel Lee for free as well. And yes, absolutely. Absolutely beloved by many, many people. And when I just say Annabel Lee, I often see people just, oh, they remember it. So actually, I'll do Annabel Lee first, and we'll finish up with Conqueror Worm. So Annabel Lee, as I stated, was published posthumously by Griswold after my death. And of course, after I passed away, that's when everybody was very interested in all of my works and wanted to know more about them and learn about my life. That's what always happens. And so many people went to Mrs. Clem and interviewed her afterwards and asked about who was Lenore and who was Annabel Lee and so on. And Mrs. Clem stated that Annabel Lee was based on Virginia, on my wife Virginia. Now, please bear this in mind. That's not something I said in my lifetime. If you had talked to me in my lifetime, my view is that poetry is universal. Poetry is the highest art that people can achieve. And so you should never say this poem means this one thing, because then it's no longer universal. It doesn't apply to everyone. And so I would consider that to be limiting the effects of the poem. But it was Mrs. Clem who stated that this was definitely based on Virginia. But I leave that up to you and your own personal life and your own personal reading to resolve on your own. So, Annabel Lee. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And that was the reason that long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind came out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels not half so happy in heaven went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea could ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in a sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea.
That's beautiful.
And lastly, for what I think won our straw poll, Conqueror Worm. Now, Conqueror Worm has its own interesting publication history, too, because it's not a standalone poem. Now, if you purchase the complete, unedited, unexpurgated versions of Edgar Allan Poe's stories from your local bookstore today, and I encourage you to do so, you will find this poem separated out into the poetry section. But it was originally part of a short story, my story Ligeia, and it's a poem in which the narrator of the story reads as part of his experiences throughout that story. So I encourage you to go back and read the story Ligeia to find the poem in its original setting. It's perfectly fine on its own, and I think it's a very entertaining poem, which is why I enjoy sharing it as well. But it's just interesting that many people don't even realize that it was a part of a larger story. And as I stated, this is perfect for an audience, and it's something that is excellent to end our formal presentation on because it ends pretty much the way we all end. So Oh, and also, if you are a fan of the horror genre, the modern horror genre, another New England writer, a more modern one who was particularly devoted to my works and very publicly stated so, was a fan of this poem. And I think that if you read Lovecraft, you'll see many of his themes all wrapped up in this one poem. So, Conqueror Worm. Lo! 'Tis a gala night within the lonesome latter years, an angel thronged, bewinged, bedight in veils and drowned in tears, sit in a theatre to see a play of hopes and fears, while the orchestra breathes fitfully the music of the spheres. Mimes in the form of God on high mutter and mumble low, and hither and thither fly. Mere puppets they who come and go at bidding of vast, formless things that shift the scenery to and fro, flapping from out their condor wings invisible woe. Oh, that motley drama, it shall not be forgot, with its phantom chased forevermore by a crowd that sees it not, through a circle that ever returneth into the selfsame spot, and much of madness and more of sin and horror, the soul of the plot. But see amid the mimic rout a crawling shape intrude, a blood-red thing that writhes without the scenic solitude. It writhes with mortal pangs, the mimes become its food, and angels sob at vermin fangs and human gore imbued. Out are the lights, out all, and over each quivering form the curtain, a funeral pall, comes down with the rush of a storm, and the angels uprising, unveiling, affirm that the play is the tragedy, man, and its hero, the conqueror worm.